That's terrible. And yet, not our problem.
If there is a cosmic plan, is it not the height of hubris to think that we can or should interfere?
Starfleet has a problem with responsibility, not with intervention. Despite what the Prime Directive might suggest, Starfleet is perfectly capable of interfering with another civilization when its officers decide the situation demands it. They will expose themselves, use their technology, save entire populations, and completely alter the natural course of society. The problem comes afterward, because once the crisis is over, Starfleet repeatedly tries to make the relationship disappear. In Pen Pals, the Enterprise saves an entire civilization, then erases a young girl's memory of the officer who made the rescue possible. In Who Watches the Watchers, when another accidental contact spirals out of control, Starfleet again attempts to erase the memories of the people involved. And when that fails, Picard repairs what damage he can, invokes non-interference, and leaves. Starfleet interfered. Starfleet changed these people's lives, but Starfleet does not want that intervention to create an obligation. And strangely enough, Stargate Command starts from almost the exact same place. In Ethon, Daniel Jackson warns that Earth's arrival through the Stargate may have destabilized an entire civilization. Jack O'Neill's first response is brutally simple.
Now, before we made contact with them, these people were considered zealots, who took the ancient text too literally. The gate being activated has given them all they need to prove that they were right all along. Their numbers will grow.
That's terrible. And yet, not our problem.
Earth didn't start their Cold War. Earth didn't create their religious divisions. Why should Earth be responsible for what happens next? But Stargate Command doesn't get to leave the question there, because the people on the other side remember them. There's no convenient memory wipe. There is no restoring the illusion that first contact never happened. When SG-1 intervenes, makes promises, and changes the political future of another world, those decisions follow them. And in Ethon, one of those promises comes back through Stargate with consequences that ultimately cost Earth an entire warship and some of the lives of its crew. That creates a comparison between Starfleet and Stargate Command that goes much deeper than the Prime Directive. Both organizations sometimes want to say, "This isn't our problem." Both can be dragged into conflicts because one of their people develops a personal connection, and once committed, both are willing to risk lives to help. But only one of them has built a philosophy that allows it to interfere, clean up the evidence, and then declare that what happens next belongs to someone else. So across Pen Pals, Who Watches the Watchers, Icon, and Ethon, I want to look at what happens when these two organizations create consequences they never intended. Because choosing not to interfere is one thing. Interfering and then deciding you aren't responsible for what comes afterward is something else entirely.
See, the Prime Directive has many different functions, not the least of which is to protect us.
For all of the differences between Starfleet and Stargate Command, the thing that finally pushes both of them into action is remarkably similar. It isn't doctrine, it isn't some carefully defined threshold where intervention suddenly becomes morally acceptable. It's a person. Someone on the other side stops being an abstract population on a view screen or a report and becomes somebody that one of their officers actually knows. Once that happens, principles that seemed clear from a distance become considerably harder to enforce. For Starfleet, that person is Sarjinka. When the Enterprise arrives at the Salkundi Drema sector, the crew isn't there to save anyone. They are investigating a geological mystery, trying to understand why planets throughout the region are destroying themselves. Sarjinka only enters the equation because Data has modified the ship's sensors to search for unusual signals. He discovers an artificial transmission coming from Drema 4, boosts it enough to understand it, and he hears a simple question coming out of the darkness. Is anybody out there? Data answers yes. That single decision changes everything that follows. He doesn't immediately report the contact and ask Picard whether the Prime Directive permits him to continue. Instead, he begins communicating with Sarjinka privately. Over the following weeks, she stops being an unknown member of a pre-warp civilization and becomes someone Data speaks with regularly. By the time Picard discovers what has happened, Data is no longer asking him to consider the fate of an anonymous civilization. He's asking him to listen to a frightened child he knows. We need to remember Picard's first instinct is still to restore the separation. He orders Data to sever the communication. From the standpoint of Starfleet's doctrine, the situation is unfortunate, but the Enterprise has no right to interfere with the natural development of Drema 4. Then, Sarjinka calls again. She isn't frightened. Her world is literally collapsing around her, and suddenly the consequences of that order aren't theoretical anymore. Picard can hear the person Starfleet is choosing to abandon. Stargate Command reaches almost exactly the same point on Tegelis. Earth's arrival doesn't create the conflict between the Rand Protectorate and the Caledonian Federation. Their Cold War has existed for decades, and the religious movement that will eventually seize control of Rand already exists. What SG-1 does is accidentally provide that movement with evidence. The Stargate, regarded by much of the population as an ancient religious artifact, suddenly activates in public and human beings walk through it from another world. To people who already believe the old stories about gods returning through the Great Ring, that isn't simply first contact. It looks like confirmation. Daniel understands the danger almost immediately. He warns that SG-1's arrival has strengthened the fundamentalists and that their numbers are likely to grow. O'Neill isn't indifferent to what might happen, but his initial position is remarkably close to the logic Starfleet uses. Tegelis has its own government, its own conflicts, and its own history. Earth didn't create those divisions, and getting further involved could make an already unstable situation worse. Daniel is what prevents that argument from ending the discussion. He believes their arrival has already changed Tegelis, and he wants to go back because he thinks he can help contain the damage. O'Neill eventually agrees, but even when he establishes limits, Daniel can maintain regular contact. But if the situation deteriorates, Earth pulls back. Just as with Data, the institution doesn't suddenly discover a new doctrine demanding intervention. One person convinces the people above him that walking away is no longer acceptable. And when the situation does deteriorate, the personal connection becomes even harder to ignore. Daniel is caught on Tegelis when the political crisis becomes a war. Suddenly, Stargate Command is deciding what responsibility Earth has towards a distant civilization. One of their own people is trapped inside the consequences of Earth's contact with it. Whatever distance O'Neill wanted to preserve has effectively disappeared. That is what makes these two cases so useful together. Starfleet and Stargate Command do not begin on opposite sides of this question. Both have reasons to stay out. Both understand that intervention can make things worse, and in both cases, that distance collapses because somebody makes the people on the other side real. Neither institution is ultimately pushed into intervention by doctrine. They are pushed into it because someone inside the institution develops a relationship that makes following the doctrine emotionally and morally difficult. But that creates a much more uncomfortable question. If a personal connection is what makes both organizations decide they cannot simply stand back and watch, what happens when that connection isn't there?
Jack, you have to let me go back.
If what you say is true, things are gonna get a little out of hand over there.
Yes, because of us. If we hadn't chosen to pay them,
They'd be far better off, I know. Daniel, we're always sticking our collective noses where they don't belong. It's what we do.
Remove the personal connection, and the comparison between Starfleet and Stargate Command becomes much less comfortable for Starfleet. Because when nobody they know is immediately in danger, both organizations are capable of reaching essentially the same conclusion. A civilization may be heading towards catastrophe. They may even have the ability to prevent it, but that does not automatically make the catastrophe their responsibility. Pen Pals makes this unusually explicit. Once Picard learns about Data's connection with Sarjinka, he brings his senior officers together to discuss what Starfleet should actually do about Drema 4. By this point, they know the planet is facing destruction. This isn't a question of whether the Enterprise has enough information or whether the danger is hypothetical. The question is whether knowing that millions of people are going to die gives Starfleet the right, or the responsibility, to stop it. What follows is important because the officers don't simply recite the Prime Directive and move on. They debate the morality behind it. If they save one civilization from a natural disaster, what principle tells them which civilization deserves intervention next? What happens when the danger is disease, war, or some other catastrophe that could be prevented with Federation technology? Once Starfleet accepts that having the power to save someone creates an obligation to do so, there is no obvious place for that obligation to end. Riker takes that logic to its most uncomfortable conclusion. Allowing the population of Drima 4 to die is not treated as some horrible misunderstanding of Starfleet values. It's presented as a legitimate option that other senior staff have to consider. LaForge pushes back against it, but that disagreement is exactly what makes the scene useful. Starfleet's officers clearly understand the human cost of doing nothing. They are debating whether that human cost changes their responsibility. That is almost exactly where Starfleet Command begins with Tegelis. Daniel explains that the activation of the Stargate has strengthened a religious movement that already existed inside the Rand Protectorate. Daniel can see where this might lead, and more importantly, he recognizes that Earth's arrival helped create the conditions making it possible. O'Neill's response strips the issue down to almost the same calculation being made aboard the Enterprise. What is happening on Tegelis is terrible, but it is not necessarily Earth's problem. The difference is that Stargate Command has already created something Starfleet desperately tries to avoid creating: a relationship. The people of Tegelis know Earth exists. Their governments have spoken with SG-1. Earth cannot simply become an unknown observer again. Even O'Neill's attempts to establish limits acknowledges that reality. Daniel is allowed to return and maintain contact, provided the situation doesn't become too dangerous. Starfleet still believes it has another option. If the contamination can be contained, the relationship itself can be removed. Sarjinka can be saved without Drima 4 becoming another civilization Starfleet is expected to protect. The immediate humanitarian problem and the long-term obligation can, at least in theory, be separated from one another. The difference begins when they finally decide to act, because once the Enterprise and Stargate Command cross that line, neither of them believes in half measures. They commit their technology, their people, and eventually their lives to solving the immediate crisis. And that is where the excuse that Starfleet simply refuses to interfere stops working. Because Starfleet absolutely will interfere. The real question is what Starfleet believes it owes these people once the rescue is over.
Your whisper from the dark has now become a plea. We cannot turn our backs.
If Starfleet's willingness to let Drima 4 die sounds cold, what happens after Picard finally makes the opposite decision is important. Starfleet does not intervene reluctantly, save Sarjinka, and then leave everyone else to their fate. Once Picard decides that the Enterprise is going to violate the principle of non-interference, the distinction between saving one child and saving an entire civilization disappears. The crew identifies the geological process destroying the planet and uses the Enterprise to stop it. Whatever argument existed about whether these people were Starfleet's responsibility ends the moment Picard decides that they are going to act. Stargate Command makes essentially the same transition on Tegelis. Daniel's presence initially gives Earth a personal reason to remain involved, but the response eventually becomes much larger than simply recovering one missing member of SG-1. By the time Soren's forces have seized control of the Rand Protectorate, Daniel is trapped inside a civil war that Earth's arrival helped accelerate. Stargate Command could theoretically define the mission narrowly, recover Daniel if possible, and treat everything happening around him as an internal conflict. Instead, the operation expands beyond Daniel himself. SG-1 works with Jared Kane and the surviving Rand loyalists to strike Soren's forces and regain access to the Stargate. At that point, Earth isn't simply recovering Daniel. Stargate Command is directly participating in an armed operation inside another civilization's civil war.
We made a promise and we intend to keep it. We'll be back to help you rebuild.
The more revealing difference appears only after the immediate danger has passed. What comes next is where their ideas about responsibility finally separate. because Stargate Command allows that intervention to become the beginning of a relationship, while Starfleet immediately begins looking for a way to make sure that its intervention does not become one. Saving Drima 4 should create a problem for Starfleet. The Enterprise has just done far more than answer a distress call. It has deliberately changed the fate of an entire civilization. Millions of people who would have died are alive because Starfleet decided that, in this particular case, non-interference was no longer acceptable. If intervention creates responsibility, then saving Drima 4 should be the beginning of Starfleet's relationship with its people. Instead, almost immediately after the crisis is resolved, Starfleet begins eliminating that relationship. Sarjenka is the only person on Drima 4 who knows what actually happened. She knows data exists. She knows that there are people beyond her world, and she knows that one of those people came to her home and saved her civilization. That knowledge is itself a violation of the separation Starfleet was supposed to maintain, so Dr. Pulaski provides a way to restore it. Sarjenka's memories of Data and the Enterprise can be erased. Starfleet cannot undo the physical intervention that saved her planet, but it can remove the evidence that the intervention ever occurred. Data is the only person who has to carry the relationship forward. Sarjenka will not remember him, but he will remember her. The emotional consequence of the intervention remains with an individual officer, while the institution itself leaves without creating any continuing obligation. There is no diplomatic relationship to manage, no expectation that the Enterprise will return, and no civilization that can someday ask why the people who saved their world disappeared immediately afterward. Starfleet gets to decide when the relationship ends because only Starfleet knows there ever was one. Stargate Command also intervenes in a catastrophe it initially wanted to avoid. Its people become directly involved in the conflict, its presence changes events on Teglis, and eventually, the immediate crisis reaches a point where SG-1 can return home. But Earth does not attempt to make its involvement disappear afterward. The people of Teglis know SG-1 exists, they know where SG-1 came from, and they know that Earth played a role in what happened to the world. More importantly, Stargate Command accepts that this knowledge creates a relationship that continues after the immediate mission is finished. The commitment at the end of Icon makes that explicit. Earth promises to return and help with reconstruction. That promise transforms intervention from a single event into an ongoing obligation. Stargate Command is no longer merely the outside power that arrived during a crisis and helped resolve it. If rebuilding becomes difficult, if the political situation deteriorates again, or if the consequences of first contact produce another crisis, the people of Teglis know who Earth is and have every reason to remember what Earth promised. This is where the comparison between the two organizations finally breaks apart. Starfleet's solution depends on making its intervention invisible once that intervention is complete. The Enterprise saves Drima 4, but Sarjenka is not allowed to carry knowledge of that rescue into her civilization's future. It leaves Teglis knowing exactly who intervened and deliberately strengthens the connection by promising that Earth's involvement is not over. The difference is not simply that Stargate Command lacks Starfleet's ability to alter memories. Starfleet treats the relationship created by intervention as another form of containment that should be removed if possible. Stargate Command treats its intervention as something that can create responsibilities extending beyond the crisis that originally justified it. SG-1 does not get that clean ending. By leaving the relationship intact, Earth also leaves open the possibility that Teglis will need it again. The promise to help rebuild sounds compassionate when it is made, but a promise only means something if it survives the moment when keeping it becomes inconvenient or dangerous. Likewise, Starfleet's ability to erase a relationship only looks like a solution as long as the erasure actually works. Fortunately, both of these ideas get tested. On Mintaka 3, Starfleet attempts to contain another accidental contact using the same basic solution, and this time, the memory procedure fails. On Teglis, the people Stargate Command promised to help eventually return with another crisis, and this time, helping them will demand far more than SG-1 originally expected. For the first time, Starfleet has to deal with a civilization that remembers what it did, while Stargate Command has to discover what accepting responsibility actually costs.
Before you start quoting me the Prime Directive, he'd already seen us. The damage was done. It was either bring him aboard or let him die.
Then why didn't you let him die?
The easiest way to test Starfleet's solution is to remove the thing that makes it possible. If Starfleet can intervene, contain the knowledge of that intervention, and then leave, it can avoid many of the responsibilities that would come with the continued contact. But Who Watches the Watchers gives us almost exactly the same situation with one critical difference. This time, Starfleet cannot make the relationship disappear. The problem on Mintaka 3 begins with Starfleet itself. Federation anthropologists have established a hidden observation post to study the Mintakans, a Bronze Age civilization whose development has deliberately been protected from outside interference. When the observation post malfunctions, a Mintakan named Liko discovers it and is badly injured. Dr. Crusher makes the decision to beam him to the Enterprise rather than allow him to die from an injury caused by the Federation's presence. Once again, Starfleet has a choice between preserving non-interference and saving the life immediately in front of them, and once again, the personal reality of that choice wins. Picard's response is revealing because Starfleet already has a solution for exactly this kind of containment. Liko can be treated, his short-term memories can be erased, and he can be returned to his people without knowing what happened. Crusher even recognizes the procedure as the same basic technique Pulaski used before, although she warns that the Mintakan brain chemistry may make it unreliable. They try it anyway. Liko is healed, returned to the surface, and Starfleet attempts to restore the separation that existed before the accident. This time, it does not work. Liko remembers everything. He remembers being transported aboard the Enterprise, remembers being healed, and most importantly, remembers Picard's name. Those memories collide with ancient Mintakan beliefs about supernatural beings, and Liko reaches an understandable conclusion based on the information available to him. The beings he encountered must be the figures his ancestors once worshipped, and the being called Picard must be their overseer. Starfleet's failed attempt to erase one relationship has now helped create something much larger. The situation quickly moves beyond anything a memory wipe could have contained. The Mintakans begin interpreting everything through the idea that Picard is a supernatural being. Palmer, one of the missing Federation researchers, becomes another piece of evidence. Troy and Riker attempt to operate among the Mintakans without revealing who they are, but eventually Troy is discovered and held because some of the Mintakans believe harming her might force Picard to demonstrate his power. Starfleet's presence has not merely exposed the existence of advanced technology, it has begun altering how these people understand reality itself. Picard recognizes the danger, and to his credit, once containment is no longer possible, he stops trying to preserve the lie. He brings Nira aboard the Enterprise and shows her what Starfleet actually is. He demonstrates that the ship is technology rather than magic, and that humanity once existed at a level much closer to the Mintakans themselves. When even that is not enough to undo Liko's belief, Picard ultimately allows the confrontation to reach its logical conclusion. Liko shoots him with an arrow, and Picard bleeds. The supposed god can be injured, and the mythology built around him finally begins to collapse. This is Starfleet taking responsibility in a way pen pals never required. Picard does not simply hide behind the Prime Directive after his people have caused the containment. He puts himself at risk to correct it, exposes information he would normally never reveal, and accepts that repairing the damage now requires further interference. But what happens once he has repaired as much as he can is just as important. Starfleet still defines responsibility as fixing the immediate contamination, not accepting an ongoing relationship with the civilization it affected. At the end, the Mintakans know that Picard and the Federation exist. The memory cannot be erased, and the encounter cannot be undone. Nura even asks why Starfleet has to leave when there is so much they could teach her people. Picard's answer returns immediately to non-interference. The Mintakans must progress in their own way, and the Enterprise leaves. Starfleet has been remembered this time, but being remembered still does not become a continuing obligation. That makes Ethon the inverse of the same test. Stargate Command never erased its relationship with Tegelis, and at the end of Icon, Earth accepted that its involvement would continue beyond the immediate crisis. The promise to help rebuild was easy to make when the fighting had ended and SG-1 was going home. Ethon asks what that promise means when Teglis becomes dangerous again. By the time Jared Kane has returned through the Stargate, the situation has deteriorated badly. Rand and Caledonia are still hostile. Reconstruction has not produced lasting peace, and a prior of the cor-ai has exploited the instability by giving Rand the means to build an orbital weapon. That weapon gives one side the ability to destroy the other with almost no meaningful possibility of retaliation. The consequences of Earth's original contact have now become entangled with a much larger conflict involving the cor-ai, but SG-1 does not use that complication as a reason to declare Teglis somebody else's problem. Daniel explicitly acknowledges why. The war on Teglis would not have happened in the same way if SG-1 had never gone there. Mitchell recalls O'Neill's own observation that every trip through the Stargate means sticking their noses into places they do not necessarily belong, while Carter points out that Earth offered to help the people of Teglis rebuild. SG-1 understands that it did not create every hatred, every political division, or every decision that followed first contact, but it also refuses to pretend that its own involvement can simply be removed from the chain of events. That does not mean Earth blindly accepts responsibility for everything Teglis does. SG-1 first attempts diplomacy. Daniel wants both Rand and Caledonia to understand what the cor-ai actually are and why accepting their technology is dangerous. When that fails to eliminate the threat, however, Stargate Command escalates. The Prometheus is sent to Teglis with the intention of destroying the satellite before Rand can use it to annihilate Caledonia. This is where accepting an ongoing obligation stops being an abstract moral position and starts having a body count. The mission does not go according to plan. The cor-ai designed satellite is far more dangerous than expected, and the Prometheus finds itself in a fight it cannot win. The ship that Earth sends back to deal with a crisis on a world SG-1 first contacted is destroyed. Colonel Pendergrass dies, members of his crew die with him, and the survivors are forced to abandon the ship. Even after losing Prometheus, Stargate Command still does not simply wash its hands of Teglis. Daniel and the surviving members of the mission continue trying to prevent Rand and Caledonia from destroying one another. A diplomatic agreement is eventually reached, but even that does not hold. After SG-1 leaves, Caledonia attacks. Rand responds, and the Stargate is presumed buried beneath the destruction. Earth loses contact with the planet anyway. By the end, Daniel and Mitchell are left talking about the memorial service, Pendergrass's death, and the 76 members of the crew who survived before learning that the political settlement they fought to create has collapsed. Their final assessment of the entire experience is painfully understandable. It was a rough day. From Starfleet's perspective, continued involvement is not simply an opportunity to help. It is the creation of a relationship that may produce obligations nobody can predict. Every promise to return creates an expectation. Every intervention makes the next intervention easier to justify. Eventually, another civilization's problems can become Starfleet's problems, simply because Starfleet helped them before. The Prime Directive is designed, at least in part, to prevent that cycle from beginning. Starfleet does not merely ask whether the immediate crisis has been solved, it tries to restore independent development as completely as circumstances allowed, explains what actually happened, and then leaves. The circumstances are different, but the objective remains remarkably consistent. Starfleet wants the civilization to continue without Starfleet becoming part of its future. Stargate Command lives with exactly that problem. The Stargate makes clean separation extraordinarily difficult because first contact creates a physical connection that remains after SG-1 goes home. Governments can negotiate with Earth, allies can ask Earth for help, and enemies can remember what Earth has done. Even when Stargate Command wants to limit its involvement, the relationship does not disappear simply because the immediate mission has ended. That means first contact in Stargate rarely remains a single event. It becomes history shared between two worlds. That is the strongest argument in Starfleet's favor, and it should not be dismissed simply because its approach can appear cold. The Federation has enormous technological power compared with civilizations like the Dremons or Mintakans. If that power becomes permanently available to every civilization Starfleet encounters, those civilizations may begin developing around the expectation that Starfleet will intervene when something goes wrong. Worse, Starfleet itself may begin believing that every problem it has the power to solve is therefore a problem it has the right to solve. Preventing dependency protects the civilization being observed, but it also limits Starfleet's ability to appoint itself guardian of everyone technologically weaker than the Federation. That is where the distinction between non-interference and responsibility becomes difficult to maintain. Starfleet wants the authority to decide that extraordinary circumstances justify changing another civilization's future, but once that decision has been made, it still wants the Prime Directive to define where its obligations end. It decides when intervention is necessary, and it decides when the consequences of that intervention are no longer its responsibility. It also means Stargate Command has to confront something Starfleet's clean exits frequently allow it to avoid. Responsibility does not necessarily end when the more powerful civilization decides it has done enough. The people affected by the intervention may have a very different understanding of what is owed to them. Leaving that relationship intact means Earth sometimes has to hear that argument, even when the answer is ultimately no, and even when saying yes produces disaster. But Starfleet's cleaner outcomes come with their own price. Preventing dependency can also prevent accountability. Restoring independent development can become indistinguishable from deciding that the people Starfleet affected no longer have any claim on it. Memory erasure makes that separation almost perfect because the civilization cannot demand accountability for an intervention it does not even know occurred. Starfleet tries to make first contact end. It contains the damage, minimizes the contamination, and restores enough separation that civilization can continue with the Federation. Stargate Command leaves the door open, intentionally or otherwise, and accepts that people on the other side may eventually walk through it again. Neither approach eliminates consequences. Starfleet tries to prevent those consequences from becoming obligations, while Stargate Command accepts obligations that can have consequences far beyond anything it intended when it first stepped through the gate. Teglis shows exactly why Starfleet would want to avoid that responsibility. Drema 4 and Mitaka 3 raise the much harder question of whether avoiding responsibility after you have already interfered is a principle at all, or simply the privilege of being powerful enough to decide when the relationship is over.